Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Create and Consume, a podcast about what we make, watch, and buy in the era of digital content. I'm your host, Austen Tosone. I have been a Swiftie for more than half of my life at this point. I have attended 5 Taylor Swift concerts in total, including the Eras Tour in Amsterdam, which you heard all about in a dedicated podcast episode. And she is repeatedly my number one artist each year when Spotify Wrapped comes out. There are very rarely any surprises. So today I wanted to do what many others have done before me and rank all of the Taylor Swift albums from, I have a hard time saying worst, but from like least favorite to most favorite. And I'm going to reveal my rankings with you all today. Before we get into that, let's talk about what I'm creating and consuming this week. So, this past week, I shared a reel slash TikTok, like a short form video to my various profiles, recapping a skincare masterclass that I attended with Sunday Riley. Now, Sunday Riley is the founder of her namesake brand, and she actually taught this skincare masterclass at the public hotels on the Lower East Side last week. I feel so fortunate to have been able to attend this event. I created a reel, like I said, sharing the products that I used, and there's also a more in-depth version of that, I guess, in my latest vlog on YouTube. So I will link both in the show notes in case you'd like to check them out. Not only is Sunday like such a fun and warm human being, but I really love her products. I love the ingredients in them, and I love just hearing more about the science behind the skincare, especially since, I don't know, I just love learning about ingredients and how they impact our skin, which ingredients layer well together, which ingredients you might want to avoid using together, and all of those various things. In terms of what I'm consuming this week, I have been basically unintentionally consuming a lot of content related to the upcoming election. So at the time you're listening to this episode, Election Day will officially be next Tuesday. However, I did want to mention that early voting is now open in both New Jersey and New York. I know a lot of my listeners are, based between those two spots. So I definitely just wanted to call it out. There's a strong chance that early voting is also open in your state if you're based in the US. So I really just wanted to encourage you all to get out there and vote, make a plan for election day, read up on the policies, and cast your votes accordingly. Let's all work together to make sure that a certain former reality television star turned convicted felon doesn't see the inside of the Oval Office again. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that. With that covered, let's move on and talk about today's episode topics, which was ranking every single Taylor Swift album. Now, I want to explain a bit about my background as a Swiftie and my methodology before I reveal the rankings. I have been a Swiftie or a fan of Taylor Swift since middle school. I remember the day still that my best friend Taylor came over to my house and showed me a YouTube music video from a new artist named Taylor Swift, and the song was Teardrops on My Guitar. I think I listened to that song probably 800 times right after I heard it, and I have been a fan and a follower of Taylor Swift's career ever since. It's safe to say Taylor Swift is my favorite artist. However, there are definitely eras of her career that I love more than others, songs that I love more than others. So that's just kind of the nature of ranking these things, is that some things need to be on the bottom and some things need to be on top. And these are my personal rankings based on my thoughts and feelings. As you guys know, I am a former magazine editor, and I've also been a content creator online for over a decade. So I am not necessarily a music expert. I am really just someone who likes to watch and take in art in different forms and write about it or create content about it or comment on it, as I do on this podcast here. So if we don't have the same rankings, if you disagree with something I say, that is more than okay. This is my opinions and my feelings, and I would definitely love to hear your rankings, your favorite songs, your least favorite songs, favorite eras, all of that stuff as well. You can always leave me a comment on social media. You could send me a DM. You could send an email. However you want to share your thoughts about Taylor Swift too. I would love to hear from you all. I've obviously seen other content creators do this, on TikTok and Instagram, but I did listen to the New York Times Popcast over the summer where they ranked every Taylor Swift album. So I decided to kind of take a bit of their methodology. So the first thing that they said they did was basically re-listen to everything, which I did last week. Now, the New York Times Popcast episode did not factor in re-recordings or vault tracks. Now, I did choose to include those in my rankings. Number one, because I want to acknowledge Taylor's complete journey as an artist, which does include re-recording some of her original music to regain control of her rights to use that music. And also, I have noticed that the vault tracks did, in fact, impact my rankings in terms of whether something landed a little bit higher than expected on the list or a little bit lower than expected on the list. I was also having a hard time trying to figure out how I would rank like the Tortured Poets department if I wasn't factoring in the anthology, or if I'm using the 3 a.m. songs from Midnights. And it also got a little confusing when I tried to score everything because Debut and Reputation do not have any re-recordings or vault tracks out at the time I'm recording this. But I really wanted to do this episode. It's been on my list since I first came up with the idea for this podcast. So once again, I re-listened to everything. I gave songs a point if I loved them. I gave them half a point if I would listen to them, but they're not my favorite. And they got no points if I usually skip them. So first I added up the totals for all of the albums, and then I also added up how many skips I had on each album. And doing that gave me a very clear top 2 and bottom 2 albums, and the rest I kind of just had to go in and put different albums against each other, basically create like a mini bracket and get to the list in that way. I hope that all makes sense. Let's get into the rankings. So the 11th best Taylor Swift album, I'm calling it 11th best, right? Because I have a hard time saying worst, is Lover. And I was actually a little surprised that Lover landed at the bottom of my list. And I think it has less to do with the songs that I like from Lover and more to do with the fact that now, just looking back on my listening history and when I think about that album from start to finish, the fact that there are a lot of songs that I think are fine, but that I generally tend to skip on here. Also, and this may be a total cliche, but like I personally feel as though Taylor's writing, storytelling, point of view is typically best when she's got a little bit of fire under her, if you know what I mean. And Lover was kind of her, I'm really happy. I am just having a very private life with Joe Alwyn, as we know, and everything's fine kind of era. I just don't really remember there being like any social discourse about this album. I remember it coming out and people liking it, and then that was kind of the main thing. And maybe it's because she never got a chance to host Loverfest, which was planned for early 2020. Obviously, we know what happened there. In my opinion, when Taylor is, going through something or defending herself, or when there's just a little bit more there, that is usually when I find that her writing and her music is the strongest. I have some total favorites from this album for sure. I mean, Cruel Summer, Miss Americana and the Heartbreak Prince, False God, like I will listen to those pretty much anytime, anywhere. But the rest of the album, there were just a lot of skips, a lot of, catchy songs, but maybe not the most memorable songs. I'm sure some people will disagree with me. I feel like this is very rarely at the bottom for people, but just on the whole, when I looked back on it, that's where it landed. Let's move on to what I think the 10th best album is, and that is Taylor Swift, aka Debut. I think it's not surprising that this one is towards the bottom, and I think there's two main reasons for that. Number one, there obviously is no re-recording or vault tracks yet to factor into my judgment of this album. And number two, this was her very first record ever. Okay, if this was number one right out of the gate, we wouldn't have anywhere to improve from. We wouldn't have anywhere to grow from. So I don't think it's surprising that this fell towards the bottom of my list. I also had quite a few skips on this album, as much as I am obsessed with and am nostalgic for a couple of key songs on this album, like Teardrops on My Guitar, which I already mentioned, Picture to Burn, Should Have Said No. I mean, those are definitely songs that caught attention and put her on the map. But for as powerful and fun and like, whoa, who is this, as those songs are, there are just a bunch on there that are skips for me, like Mary's song, Invisible. It's interesting because I think she takes themes from those songs and explores them in such a stronger way as she continues to develop as an artist and as she releases more albums, which I'm sure I'll talk about later in this episode. So I feel like this was like the seeds were planted, but it was just so early that there's just not really much more to say about it other than like it was the beginning. Let's move on to what I think is Taylor Swift's ninth best album, and that is Midnights. I really hope I don't get canceled for this, but like that there is no theme to Midnights, okay? Like, and I guess there doesn't always need to be, but to me, Midnights is no plot, just vibes. And I just personally feel like Taylor is her best when there is some cohesion to the album, even if that cohesion is a little bit convoluted or all over the place, as we'll get to in some of the later albums. But at least that is more of like a distinct point of view. I love very like standout songs from Midnights. I mean, I am here for Karma, I'm here for You're on Your Own Kid, I'm here for Maroon. Like those are such strong individual songs for me, but as a whole, this album just doesn't connect to the dots very well for me, and I feel like there are quite a few songs that I end up skipping past. In fact, I think this might have actually been my most skips on an album. I mean, vigilante shit, like I just find songs like that so strange. Like that to me sounds like an artist who was trying to replicate Reputation. You know what I mean? And again, I think there's a lot to be said for kind of her emerging from the Joe bubble relationship wise at the time that Midnights came out. But there were some great one liner lyrics and some catchy beats that came from Midnights. But overall, as a whole, and also especially factoring in the 3 a.m. edition, pretty much all of those are skips for me aside from Would've, Could've, Should've. If I planned a party and just played Midnights from start to finish, like the vibes would be all over the place. And I think it's interesting because I think we as a society don't necessarily listen to albums from start to finish as we once used to. But since I just did that for this exercise, and since I did it so back to back, like in one day, in one sitting, which I don't actually recommend, but by doing that, it just became so much more apparent to me which albums were more sonically in sync and which albums were not. And this was one of the ones that was a little bit like getting jerked around. Let's move on to the eighth best Taylor Swift album, which is Fearless. I do feel like it's a little easier to defend having some of her earlier stuff towards the bottom of this list than something as recent as Midnights. However, when it comes to Fearless, I actually think this album flows really well together from a sound and music perspective. I think there are great, great lyrics in this album. I remember listening to this album ad nauseum when it first came out. Fearless was also the first ever Taylor Swift concert that I went to. It's hard not to be nostalgic for what Fearless represented at the time in my life that I remembered hearing it. It's funny because when I first started listening to this again, I was like, oh my gosh, yes, like Fearless, 15, Love Story. Like I started out on such a high with those songs. And as I kept going, I did just have a few that I was like, yeah, I guess not my favorite overall, like, or, oh, I guess I usually do skip this one. And I will also add that since I was factoring in the vault tracks to this ranking, those are kind of my lowest collective group of vault tracks for me. Like, those usually are the ones that I skip. I actually forgot about quite a lot of them, like when I went back to listen to this, and I think that's kind of saying a lot. I remember when other re-recordings came out, I started hearing some of those songs even on the radio. I don't really listen to the radio a lot, but sometimes I do when I'm driving. And I remember those songs being played or, you know, walking into like a grocery store and hearing them, and I can't tell you a single time that's happened with a Fearless vault track. I like The Other Side of the Door in the vault section, and that's about it. I think to me, Fearless is the very clear link between Taylor Swift, the debut album, which started out very country, and then Fearless starting to lean a little bit more into pop before making like the full transition into pop with her third album, which we'll get to. Looking back on Fearless as a whole album, to me, it still felt like someone who was developing and honing their voice and who was kind of figuring out where they fit sonically in like the genres of music that we know: pop, country, indie, rock, etc., etc. We definitely did get some incredible songs from Fearless, and I do feel like it paved the way for a lot that was still to come. Let's move on to the seventh best album, which for me is Evermore. I actually thought this was crazy because I feel like a few years ago, Evermore was like in my top 3 for me. And I do still think that Evermore is one of my most listened to albums. Like, if you were to pick apart my Spotify listening history, there's a lot of Evermore in there. Evermore is also the album that got me through a week of quarantining by myself in Queens back in 2020 before I went home for Christmas. I've been seeing a lot of people actually on TikTok and Instagram talk about how they are feeling weirdly like nostalgic almost for that quarantine time. And while it was obviously like an unsettling and upsetting time in a lot of ways, it was also just such like a quiet, introspective time for a lot of people. And that actually is like perfectly encapsulated in the week that I spent in this apartment by myself listening to Evermore, like basically on repeat. I just wanted to shout that out. Like, I do have a soft spot for Evermore, even though it is, ranking where it is on this list for me. And in my eyes, the first 4 songs of Evermore played like in a row all the way through are just absolutely perfect in my eyes. Like, no notes, nothing I would change. I just want Willow into Champagne Problems, into Gold Rush, into 'Tis the Damn Season. Like, when I hear one of those songs, I expect to hear the next 3 in succession after that, because that's just how they're wired together in my brain. Like, that is just such a lovely batch of songs. And, there are a bunch on Evermore that I truly love that come after that too. I mean, I love Coney Island featuring The National. I love Long Story Short, and I love Right Where You Left Me, which is one of the bonus tracks. But I think even Taylor herself knew that by coupling this as a sister album to Folklore, releasing it so close to Folklore, and also choosing to release it second, it does almost feel like it's an album of vault tracks from Folklore, even though they do have some key differences to them. I just think it is so clear that even though they are considered sister albums, and even though they are often paired together, and she's even condensed them together in the Eras Tour set list since she started the tour in 2023, it's just always going to come second to Folklore, which obviously is reflected in my rankings because we haven't gotten to Folklore yet. And I like Evermore for exactly what it is. I don't think it really needs to be anything more than what it is. Let's move on to Taylor's 6th best album, and that is Red. I was pretty shell-shocked when I did my rankings and realized that Red was this low down for me, because I have historically always kind of thought of Red as my favorite Taylor Swift album. And the more I think about it, the more I think that was because of the time in my life when Red came out. Red came out when I was a freshman in college. I remember listening to the album at midnight with my friends and just listening to it over and over again, walking around campus, experiencing so many different things for the first time, like living away from home, having a roommate, having added responsibilities, being in charge of my own schedule completely. Red truly lined up just with so many firsts in my life. And I think for that reason, it's like an especially nostalgic album for me. And that's why I've always regarded it so highly in my head. But as I did this, listen back as I was doing this, I definitely noticed which songs I kind of listened to more out of habit and which songs I was listening to because I genuinely loved them. And the ratio kind of was like more split on this one for me. And I think that's also okay. That's the whole point and the fun of all of these different eras, is that they can coordinate and collide with different times in your life and how you felt about certain things at the time and how you feel about things now looking back on them. And I think that that is what is so cool about just being a music lover and someone who listens to music in the first place, is certain songs will bring back certain memories for you and make you feel a certain way all over again. I'm not unique probably in the fact that one of my all-time favorite Taylor Swift songs is on this album, and that is of course All Too Well. I loved that song from the moment I first heard it, and then when we got the 10-minute version with the Red re-recording, that just totally set me over the edge. I basically know every single word to that song. I will listen to it anytime, anywhere. I love the story behind it, and I'm so glad that we actually got it in the vault tracks for Red. Looking at the vault tracks for Red, I definitely like them. I wouldn't say that I love them as much as I love some of the other vault tracks that we'll get to. I do like The Very First Night and Message in a Bottle. I also love Comeback Be Here, which I don't even think totally registered with me the first time that Red came out, and I would definitely say is a song I listen to more now than I did back then. So that was a bonus track, meaning it wasn't in the original studio album, but it got released like in some kind of secondary Red Deluxe or something like that. And I also, of course, love 22 and Begin Again are probably some of my other favorite songs from Red. Now, something that was interesting to me as I listened through, like from debut all the way through Tortured Poets Department, was in debut, Taylor has a lot of male vocalists backing her. And I don't know if that's more of a country thing or that's just something they had her do in the very beginning, but I really enjoyed hearing her voice come through more in Fearless and Speak Now. So when I got to Red, and there was like the Ed Sheeran and Gary Lightbody tracks, to me it kind of just felt a little bit more old school for some reason, even though, you know, she goes on to collaborate with many more artists. But I think I could have done maybe without those. No shade to either of them, but adding in those male vocals to what I was kind of expecting to be one of Taylor's most emotionally deep albums, which I do think Red is. I don't know, for some reason, they just felt a tiny bit out of place to me. Let's move on to the fifth best Taylor Swift album, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but that's the Tortured Poets Department. Guys, I'm so shocked and shook by this. I did not like TTPD the first time I heard it. And I stand by my first criticism of it, which was this is way too many songs. Like, this is way too long. I stand by that. And I also listened to an episode of the Popcast where the two music critics who do that show actually broke out the Tortured Poets Department and they made their own 15 song albums, and they chose basically their favorites from both the Tortured Poets Department and the anthology and kind of like restructured the albums according to their preferences because they said it's way too long, and then they were like, well, how would we edit this? It's very interesting, and it's like a clear choice to me that Taylor chose to release an anthology with TTPD and not just like a couple of bonus songs, or obviously not really vault tracks since this was an album she was releasing in real time. It does not need to be re-recorded. Obviously, she owns the work, and again, that felt like an intentional choice. And this is where I look at an album like the Tortured Poets Department and I compare it to Midnight's. And in some ways, you could argue that Midnight's is maybe more concise or more intentional. But again, I felt like I was missing a common thread with Midnight's. And the common thread of the Tortured Poets Department is we're kind of having a manic episode here. We're kind of going all over the place. And even being all over the place in this case was the thread that tied everything together for me, listening back to not just the Tortured Poets Department, but that plus the anthology together. It's a true representation of Taylor's emotional roller coaster that she was on in the summer of 2023 and for some time before that as well. That clearly all culminates in I Can Do It With a Broken Heart, which I think is one of the best songs from not just that album, but maybe that she's ever written. It comes back to like, what is Taylor Swift's emotional journey? Taylor is best known and revered for writing about her personal relationships and her emotions. So having this coming off the heels of Midnight's and even coming off the heels of Folklore and Evermore, which were just like quieter albums, and Folklore, which wasn't even really about her own experiences, it kind of felt like we needed TTPD. For me, it's one of those albums that the more I listened to it, the more I liked it, and the more I picked up and pieced together lyrics that were almost like a call and answer to previous songs that she had written. There's just so much to unpack and piece together. You can kind of make of it what you want. I also loved like the Down Bad performance from the Eras Tour set list. I feel like seeing some of those songs performed even gave me a new perspective on them. I mean, this gave us lyrics like, "What if he's written mine on my upper thigh only in my mind?" Like, oh my god. "Did you really beam me up in a cloud of sparkling dust just to do experiments on? Tell me I was the chosen one. Show me the world is bigger than us, then send me back where I came from." It's like a Taylor Swift lyric lover's dream and a casual Taylor Swift listener's nightmare. The fourth best Taylor Swift album in my rankings is 1989. And I have to admit, I don't necessarily think about 1989 that much as an album, but when I listened back to it, I just had an absolute blast listening to all of these songs. When I think back on what was going on in my life when 1989 came out, I was, I believe, a junior in college. I had just spent my first year in New York. I remember I also flew to Europe by myself to visit some friends who were studying abroad. It just felt like truly the start of a new chapter. It just felt like independence. It just felt like a reason to go out and do fun things with your friends and just celebrate being alive. Obviously, Welcome to New York came out at that time when I was living in New York, so you can just imagine how insufferable I was with that. And then I just remember like screaming the lyrics to Blank Space and Style at parties, like with my sorority sisters and with my friends in college. Just so many instant classics from that album that now I feel like are intertwined with Taylor Swift and who she is. Great lyrics also. "You're still all over me like a wine-stained dress I can't wear anymore." That is from Clean, the last song on that album. I would say that song is underrated, but I think thanks to the re-recording that came out last year, it's really not underrated and many more people know about it now. "When you're young, you just run, but you come back to what you need from This Love." I fell even more in love with This Love when I heard the re-recorded version of it in the trailer for The Summer I Turned Pretty on Amazon Prime. That ties back even deeper into like my adolescence because I grew up reading and loving those books by Jenny Han. The Summer I Turned Pretty, if you don't know, is based on books. Imagine that. There's only a few skips on this album for me. I don't usually listen to Out of the Woods, although I do know every word to the bridge. I usually skip I Know Places. I actually enjoyed the 1989 vault tracks just as much as I enjoyed some of the original songs from that album. And this was an album where when those vault tracks came out, like I could not turn on the radio or walk into a store without hearing Is It Over Now? And I think that speaks to the success of those vault tracks and just how well they really fit in with the original album. Let's move on to the third best Taylor Swift album, which is Reputation. This was just such an insane moment to live through if you were a Taylor Swift fan at this time because we hadn't heard from her. We didn't know what was going on. And then one day the snakes just started appearing on Instagram and you were like, oh, buckle up, like something is happening. When I listened back to Reputation, this was basically a no skip album for me. Like every song that came on when I heard those first few notes, I was like, oh, yes, like it's Dress, it's Delicate, it's Call It What You Want. There are just so many incredible songs in here. And what I love about this album is even though it was sonically very different from pretty much anything else Taylor had done up until that point, the lyrics were still there, the heart was still there. Like it was almost like saying, oh, there's still a little bit of what we recognize, but also totally closing an old chapter and opening a new one, even by saying the old Taylor can't come to the phone right now. Why? Because she's dead. There was just such like a clear decision of a transition. And I think that this album was really cool because it was such a statement. It was such a risk, and it was one that completely paid off. I think this was really the first time, aside from her romantic relationships, that we kind of started looking for clues in songs about things that had happened, about other celebrities, about what was really going on behind the scenes. I think this was the beginning of the social media Easter eggs as it relates to Taylor Swift. Like, I don't really remember Easter eggs being a thing with her first 5 albums, but when it came to Reputation, it was just one of those things where we were peeling back the layers. We were like looking for more. We were just trying to uncover what was really going on. There is an extremely clear theme in this album. It's about reputation, it's about reclaiming your name, it's about, the legacy that you leave behind. I was just trying to decode my own notes. I wrote, "This is pretty much a no skip album for me, minus TIWWCHNT." And I was like, what the hell is that? And now I realize it's "This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things," and I just don't like the music on that one. But even that song to me, like, I understand why it's in the album. I understand why it's there to contrast some of the other ones. I have to say, I am so excited for the re-recording of this one, and I'm dying to hear the vault tracks. Let's move on to the number 2 Taylor Swift album, which is Folklore. This, to me, is not just one of Taylor Swift's best albums, but one of the most beautiful, impactful, thoughtful albums that I've heard from any artist as long as I've been alive. It really is up there. I wrote in my notes, "A quieter album that spoke volumes." It's so interesting because, as a writer myself also, I don't know if you guys took many like nonfiction or creative writing classes ever, but people, teachers, whoever will always say, write what you know. And Taylor had been writing what she knew for years and years, like almost a decade at that point. And my favorite thing about Folklore is that it's still my favorite storyteller, but talking about other characters, other people. Like, it's not about Taylor. And I think that is also what opened this album up to a whole new crop of people who became fans of hers, who maybe weren't fans of her music, since they were 13, like me, but people who really got exposed to her through an album like Folklore, especially the fact that it came out in 2020. It came out, at a time where people were at home. They wanted like that comfort soundtrack to their lives, and we needed a quieter album from Taylor. Like I said, quieter album that spoke volumes. It was just an opportunity to have some of those more indie folk leaning songs that we hadn't really ever gotten to see from her before. At this point, we had seen country, we had seen pop, we had even seen her lean into like rock a little bit, I would argue, with Reputation. Folklore really stands on its own, and I think that's probably one of the things I love about it the most. It is also one of my favorite albums lyrically that Taylor has ever done. August sipped away like a bottle of wine, a string that pulled me out of all the wrong arms into that dive bar. Like, there are just like every single song on Folklore has lyrics that if I were reading them in like a poetry book, I feel like I would be highlighting. There are a few songs on Folklore that I, sometimes will skip past, or that maybe I don't know all the words to, but again, overall, the theme of the album is so clear. You can even hear within the songs how like characters tie together. James, Betty, all of these people. I think it's Taylor's coziest album, and I think it's one that she is always going to be remembered for, even if you take all of Taylor Swift in the public eye out of the conversation about just her music. This is one that truly can stand on its own, and I think that's probably one of the things that she's most proud about with Folklore, and it's one of the things that I, just as a fan, recognize and take with me when I think about Folklore. Folklore and Evermore are also my favorite albums to listen to, like in this current season that we're going into. So as I work, like they will be on in the background as I'm formatting blog posts or as I'm setting up and breaking down equipment. Like, they really are the soundtrack to my fall winter, and I wouldn't have it any other way. And you may have already guessed by now, because there is one album that I have not yet talked about, which brings us to my number 1 Taylor Swift album, Speak Now. I was equally surprised and delighted when I realized that this album came out on top, because this to me is Taylor Swift. If I could sum up everything about being a Taylor Swift fan into one key album, I really do think Speak Now is that choice. When I think back on my Taylor Swift fandom for 17 years, is that right? 13 plus 17, I guess, is 30. So if I could sum up and pick one album that I feel like says this is what listening to Taylor Swift's music feels like, I would say it's Speak Now. I think the reason this inched out over Folklore is because, again, I think Taylor is strongest when she speaks about her experience and when she's coming from a very clear point of view. I really think Speak Now is just one of those lightning in a bottle albums. Like, I remember how excited I was when it came out. I remember screaming every song at that concert. Every word, like, sticks in my head, even all of these years later. And I think it's a testament to the timelessness of those songs and just how catchy and thoughtful and well done they are. And I think it's interesting because this to me is one of Taylor Swift's most clearly pop albums compared to something like Folklore, compared to something like Debut. And I just think that this is where she thrives in pop. You can really hear her vocal range in this album, from something as loud as Haunted or Long Live, where she's really like belting out, or something quieter like Dear John. When I think about vocal range, when I think about lyrics, when I think about music, like everything fits together so well on Speak Now. Literally, the only skip I had in the original album here was Never Grow Up. And it's not because I don't like that song, but I just think that The Best Day from Fearless and You're on Your Own Kid from Midnights are better interpretations of that exact theme. And I absolutely love these vault tracks. Like, these are the vault tracks to beat, in my opinion. Electric Touch featuring Fallout Boy sounds like a song that I knew from 2010. Or what year was Speak Now? Yeah, 2010. Oh, October 25th. So happy 14-year anniversary to Speak Now. Like, that song, when I heard it, it felt like I already knew what it was. It just fit in so seamlessly. I love When Emma Falls in Love. I love Castles Crumbling. And I very clearly love Timeless because that was our literal wedding song. Shout out to Taylor Swift for dropping this re-recording in July of 2023, 2 months before we were set to get married. What would I have done without this song? I actually have no idea. Okay, everyone, I hope you enjoyed hearing my thought process and my methodology for how I did this ranking, and that you enjoyed hearing my pretty unfiltered thoughts about all of these albums and songs. I don't know of too many other artists that I could do this for because I am definitely the most familiar with all of Taylor Swift's music, more so than any other musician. However, if you enjoyed this episode, I did also recently draft my Eras Tour set list Austen's version, where I went in and picked out 44 songs and 2 surprise songs that I would like played at the Eras Tour. A little different from Taylor's current set list, so I do have that written out if you guys are interested in an episode about that. And I also would love to update this episode once Debut and Reputation are re-recorded and we can hear what those sound like, or if we happen to get TS12 between now and that time. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. You have no idea what it means to me, especially if you've made it this far all the way to the very end. And just as a reminder, there are a few things you can do to support Create and Consume for free. You can leave me Apple and Spotify ratings and reviews. You can like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell if you watched this episode on YouTube. You can follow along at Create and Consume Pod on Instagram and TikTok. You can send this episode to a friend who might enjoy it, maybe a fellow Swiftie. And don't forget to check out createandconsumepodcast.com for episode recaps and more. Thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.